into a large Dutch family, headed by a Protestant minister. Vincent's mother was devoutly religious and kept her hands busy at all times. All the Van Gogh children were taught arts and crafts, and to make handmade as gifts. Vincent spent much time in nature, not only on day walks with the family, but alone in the countryside, where he collected insects and other specimens for his nature collection. Frida Kahlo was born into a not small Mexican family, headed by a German immigrant photographer. Frida's mother was devoutly Catholic, taught her daughters how to keep a beautiful and neatly appointed home, and managed the family's fiscal affairs. Frida collected plant specimens for her nature collection and had an interest in biology, later using medical books as references for her painting. Vincent desired to follow in his father's footsteps to become a minister. He spent time in seminary, preached in churches, and lived out his faith as a volunteer minister in a poor mining town for 2 years. His bouts of asceticism, living only on bread and coffee, giving away his possessions, including clothing and shoes, so that his appearance was unseemly, were unsettling to the townspeople and the church leaders, and he was removed from the post. Frida held the Catholic beliefs she was raised with until young adulthood, but later professed atheism. However, she referred to the person of La Pelona, death, frequently in her correspondence. Death appeared in her paintings as well as in her home decoration, in keeping with the Mexican culture she held so dear, to say nothing of her feeling of death's closeness to her in particular, given her brush with it and her continuing health issues. I believe I remember correctly that Vincent was the only one of his family sent away to boarding school, and this was done as an intervention to try to straighten out his strange behavior, disappearing to wander in the country for long hours, staying amongst persons beneath his station, isolating himself when at home. He was not happy to be sent away and insisted on returning home. Later, he was enrolled in seminary upon his request, but he struggled in his studies and quit. Later, established in his art practices, he signed himself up to study at an art school in France, studying alongside Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec and others, but clashed with teachers even while inspiring fellow students. Frida was the only one of her family to be sent to school since she was the most intelligent and her father's favorite. She wished to become a doctor. At school, she joined in with a group of friends, some of whom would become lifelong friends. And though she and her group terrorized the school with their pranks and demonstrations against dull teachers, Frida managed to avoid expulsion because the guy above the guy who wanted to expel her said something to the effect of, "If you can't control that little girl, you have no business being in charge." Vincent worked a few jobs, including at his uncle's gallery, where he tended to clash with the customers, and so he was sent to a different location where he would have less contact with customers. But he had his head so far up his Bible that he couldn't be bothered to care much about work. He also worked at a bookshop for a while, but was chronically underslept due to staying up late reading and obsessing over his collection of art prints. He worked briefly as a teacher at a boys' boarding school, but I believe he left because they weren't paying him as promised. Vincent decided to make art his profession and received financial help from his brother Theo, eventually striking a deal in which Theo paid him a living allowance in exchange for artwork from Vincent. The specifics of the arrangement were frequently renegotiated. This let Vincent feel as though he was not accepting charity from his brother, but instead was exchanging something for something. As it turned out, the value of what he traded to Theo went so high as to become inestimable. Vincent sold a few drawings to other patrons, but not many. Frida took up painting as an occupation after a serious trolley accident left her bedridden for several months. She began by painting portraits of herself and her family. She showed her paintings to Diego Rivera, the most famous artist in Mexico, whom she met and lightly terrorized years earlier while he painted murals at her school, who encouraged her painting and married her. During her marriage to Diego, She did not need to earn money to live, and so she devoted herself to her husband, her home, her friends, and sometimes her painting. Later in life, she desired to support herself on her painting in order to gain independence from her husband, so she sold paintings and took commissions. She was a professor at art at a local school for 10 years, though she taught from home for most of that time. Vincent painted in plein air. In all kinds of weather, he would load himself up with his easels and paints and canvases and trudge out into the country or the city or wherever he wanted to capture something. Then he would plunk it all down and stay all day or all evening before trudging back, suffering bodily discomfort, damage to his wet canvases, and dangers to his person. Indeed, the latest research suggests that his death was an accident, involving some local boys who repeatedly tormented Vincent by taunting him and tampering with his materials. Although Paul Gauguin, who lived with Vincent briefly, saw the value in field sketching, Gauguin preferred to take his sketches back to the studios to make his paintings in serenity. It is easy to see the wisdom in this. If nothing else, one is sure a bathroom breaks being loads easier. Frida, though she loved to run around before the trolley accident, found herself much confined in her adult life. At the beginning, she painted in bed with a special easel and suspended mirror provided by her parents. Painting mostly on a small scale, she worked on site with Diego as he executed his murals at home and abroad. Later in life, Frida painted in her studio, sometimes tying herself into her own wheelchair for support. In the last years of her life, she kept an art journal in which she would draw and paint and write the most unhinged things of all lying in bed. Vincent painted almost exclusively from life. Though he briefly experimented with painting from his imagination, he preferred the feeling of connection with God's creation and the attempt to understand or communicate something of what God had wrought. He had a large viewfinder made of a wood frame with a grid of wires. This helped him to determine the composition of his picture and relationships and proportion of objects within the composition. Money was a great concern for Vincent, and materials were at a premium. This is one reason for his insistence that a mastery of drawing is essential for good painting. After all, he said, drawing is just painting in black. Frida began her painting career bedridden, painting herself first using a mirror. But even without a mirror, many or most of her paintings represented her in some way. She paints herself as a child, as a deer, a hemorrhaging nude, a baby. She represents her own feelings in paintings of other people, and in still lives of fruit. Though she couldn't help but be influenced by her husband's larger-than-life painting, which was infamously political to the point of costing him work, even when she wanted to make her paintings more political to help the Communist Party, she didn't succeed. Painting a little communist flag sticking out of a piece of fruit was about all she could muster. Frida's main subject remained herself and the imaginary world. Her solitude and infirmity turned her focus inward, and her career ended where it began, bedridden. Her four-poster bed, decorated with pictures of her loved ones and heroes, including Joseph Stalin, was part of the exhibition at her only solo show in Mexico, a show that took place in the final year of her life. At the opening of this show, she was placed in her bed to receive congratulations from the attendees. Some reviewers of the show took exception to the appearance of Frida's own person becoming part of the exhibition, but Frida herself was excited to make the appearance. Vincent loved women, but mostly associated with the unfortunate types. Therefore, he never made a match suited to his family's sensibilities. As a younger man, he attempted to woo a widowed cousin, but she rejected his advances. Later, he took up with a fallen woman and brought her and her children to live with him. He wished to marry her, but was made to forsake her, upon the threat of losing support from his brother and having no means on which to live. Vincent frequented ladies of the night and contracted syphilis. Frida was obsessive in her love, first for her school boyfriend Alejandro, the refined, intelligent leader of her circle of school friends, and then for Diego. Her relationship with Alejandro eventually fizzled out after his family sent him to Europe following Frida's accident. Fortunately, Frida found a fatter fish to fry, another intelligent leader with fame to boot. In her art journal, written during her last years, she wrote to Diego continually, elevating his status from her husband to her mother, father, sun, moon, universe, her own self. Diego's fame and riches recommended him to her family. He paid off her parents' mortgage before marrying Frida. Frida and Diego had many love affairs and dalliances outside of their marriage. Both apparently contracted syphilis. Vincent's dress and appearance were a barrier between himself and civilization. Though he was raised to take pride in his dress and always let them see you are a gentleman, he took a spiritual attitude that clothing and appearances weren't as important as the soul, or that they weren't as important as the work he wanted to do, whether ministering or painting. His youthful predilection for traipsing around the countryside was enough to wreck his good clothes even when he lived with his parents. But once he was on his own and engaging in the punishing rigors of art, with his messy habits of letting his clothes become spoiled with paint, etc., he made himself an eyesore. Though he had gentleman friends who maintained a genteel appearance while being artists and working, painting, drawing in the field, Vincent couldn't be bothered to keep his clothes nice, nor could he afford to buy new clothes or to keep his hair trimmed. Frida took great care in her personal appearance. Though she preferred a boyish dress in her youth, she found with Diego that he liked her in the traditional Tijuana style of dress. She put thought and sometimes last-minute embroidery into her ensembles each day, which included accessories, jewelry, and elaborate hairstyles using ribbons and flowers. She groomed her unibrow and mustache with a small comb. Her stylized appearance, along with her small size at 5'3", made her larger than life while also non-threatening. Vincent, despite a vigorous constitution that withstood much elemental exposure throughout his life, was possessed of personality traits that made relationships difficult. Many people were frightened of his passionate speech. With strangers or friends, he would raise his voice and gesticulate feverishly, escalating conversations to a high pitch at the drop of a hat. His career failures, ousting by his family, and poverty were stressors that led to his malnutrition and excessive use of alcohol, absinthe, and pipe tobacco. He was hospitalized several times for syphilis or madness. He has been posthumously diagnosed as having had temporal lobe epilepsy, which accounts for his psychotic episodes that occurred in greater frequency toward the end of his life. Frida's health was somewhat frail since a child, and the trolley accident was an event of significant trauma. Frida endured several lengthy hospital stays, one of which lasted an entire year. However, much of the later intervention Frida received may have been unnecessary. Experts on her life suggest she exhibited Munchausen syndrome, with a pattern of requesting an operation, having the operation, and then making herself worse by sabotaging her own recovery. Frida smoked cigarettes, drank heavily, and became dependent on morphine after an operation on her spine. She made several suicide attempts towards the end of her life. Vincent died a slow death as a result of a mysterious gunshot wound he sustained while painting in the countryside. Information has come out in recent years that indicates Vincent was shot accidentally by a youth of his acquaintance. Evidence to this effect includes the fact that neither Vincent's painting materials nor the gun were ever found. Plus, we know from Vincent's writing that he disliked guns and the idea of suicide. Also, it was known that the youth in question had been given a gun and went around with it, acting like a cowboy. On his deathbed, Vincent insisted that no one else be blamed for his fatal injury. His brother went to him upon learning of the shooting, and the two talked for many hours before Vincent finally slipped away. Frida's official cause of death was listed as pulmonary embolism, but it is speculated she may have overdosed on painkillers. It is also possible that this death was premeditated or assisted. Her final diary entry reads, "I hope the exit is joyful and I hope never to return. She died in the night." Vincent's brother Theo was his lifeline, the one family member who supported him emotionally and financially. Vincent wrote copious letters to his brother, so copious that his complete letters have been published as a 3 volume set, and the volumes are not thin, and the pages are not thick, and the type is not large. Tragically, Theo Van Gogh died also having syphilis shortly after Vincent did, and it is largely thanks to Theo's wife Jo Bonger that Vincent is as famous as he is today. She was left a widow with a young child in an apartment full of Vincent's paintings and letters. However much she loved her late husband and sympathized with her late brother in law, her motivation in promoting this art and publishing Vincent's letters must have had a lot to do with supporting herself and her child. Fortunately for the world, her campaign succeeded, and we have been made aware of Vincent and his work. Jobonger's son founded the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, which displays artwork by Vincent and his contemporaries. Frida's closest relationship was with Diego, and they formed a world famous power couple. Even the newspapers referred to them by first name only because everyone knew who they were. Frida's reputation and signature look preceded her, and through Diego she met people from all around the world, including the rich and famous. Diego's second marriage to Frida, the two had divorced from each other, was advised to both by her doctor, who believed it would improve her health. Although Frida felt lonely and longed for Diego when he wasn't there, she also had other love affairs, plus many friends and visitors to her home or the hospital during her lengthy stays. She was an art teacher for 10 years and taught students in her home. Frida had a live in nurse in her last years, as well as her sister Christina, who was her closest companion until the end. The Frida Kahlo Museum has its residence in the blue house Casa Azul, where Frida and Diego lived, displaying Frida's artwork, wardrobe, and other objects she loved. Vincent is the quintessential tortured artist. Everyone has a cousin with a Vincent complex. The reason for this is his prolific writings, which were published posthumously. If all we had of him was his paintings, we might have thought he was a serene fellow who really liked dash marks. It's the writing that has let us all know who he was, and that makes us feel like we know him or know what it was to be like him. Frida did not need to write thick volumes of letters to show us her suffering. She put it directly on canvas. Frida's paintings are often gory and bloody, or feature Frida giving the viewer an unsettling gaze, wearing a mustache painted darker than it really was. I remember thinking the two Fridas with the exposed hearts and veins was weird and gross when I saw it as a young person. Plus, the unibrow was kind of strange. Frida's whole personality was boiled down to a unibrow, almost as significantly as Hitler's was his mustache. She aimed for a decorative style in many of her paintings, adding shells or other objects to the frames to suggest them as folk art, lest she be judged as a wannabe fine artist next to her giant husband with his giant murals, paid for by the giants of the globe. However, her art journal was freer and seemed more honest in all its obsessive notions. Her tone is raucous, rabid, and unrestrained. She wasn't trying to make it fit into a classification or to make it palatable for anyone. It is in her art journal that I love Frida most. Vincent was always paying people to do things, whether it was models to pose for him or women to sleep with him. Though he had far less skill in depicting people than landscape or still life, he insisted he needed models to paint. Doubtless, it was an effort to get his social needs met, since he had no family close by. He frequently wrote to his brother Theo that days go by where I don't speak to a single person. Vincent's habit of turning any conversation into a vehicle for converting another person to his way of thinking had an alienating effect on others wherever he went. Thea was his main correspondent and his only source of income. Vincent continually asked for more money for various reasons. When he received his allowance, he would spend lavishly until it was gone, often on women and wine, and then proceed to live on bread and coffee until he received his next allotment, begging his brother for more in the interim. Vincent sent Theo sketches so that Theo could see his progress, but he also asked for them back sometimes, saying that having them back would be helpful to his work. Frida was adept at techniques that endeared her to others, keeping up appearances in a display of alegria, joy and happiness. She had a beautiful home and the means to entertain her friends well with food and drink. She also gave gifts spontaneously from her collections of beautiful items she enjoyed buying at the markets. When Frida used four-letter words, she did so to a warm and gratified audience. She wrote illustrated letters to her friends full of solicitation, signed them with obscene numbers of kisses, and urged them not to forget her. Having an outsized appetite for love, and not restricting herself to her husband, she practiced her feminine wiles on whomever tickled her fancy. She made a habit of ingratiating herself to the women Diego saw, winning them as her own friends or lovers, since they were already Diego's. Frida made herself an attractive companion and nurtured her relationships. She made gifts of some of her portraits and received financial assistance from friends when she wrote asking for dough for this or that. Vincent was an outcast during his life. Frida was very popular during hers. Both of these people communicated their suffering at length. Both experienced extended misery, turned to substances, got VD, and died after years of poor mental health. Frida lived 10 years longer than Vincent, which could be attributed to the financial stability of her marriage, or the severity of Vincent's illness and lack of knowledge or treatments available for his condition. Neither had children. Vincent's output was greater than Frida's, as was his skill in drawing and painting. His paintings have greater mass appeal since many are landscapes and still life compositions of flowers. These subjects are time-honored and respectable. Frida's paintings of herself are an extension of her continual self-creation. She carefully crafted her own image, either of herself or of a vision in her mind, and then painted her own craftsmanship, which sometimes included blood or gore that wouldn't pass a G rating. Vincent wanted to connect with God's creation. Frida wanted to connect with her own creation. Frida did not believe in God. Vincent's paintings are lovely and harmonious, whereas Frida's are often bloody, brutal, and are mostly portraits of the same person over and over. However, I think her painting, Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo, is a masterpiece that outshines every other painting of hers I've seen. What's funny about it is that she finally had enough things to paint that her face is almost an afterthought, cartoonish, and it just doesn't matter. Furthermore, reading her art diary with all its variety and imagination gives one a taste of what she might have achieved had she lived longer or devoted more time to her art, especially in earlier years. I thought I was writing this post to show that Frida was more popular in life and therefore a better example to follow than Vincent's, but then I remembered she wasn't happy either. She spent more time socializing to avoid solitude and less developing her craft, which shows in her work. She tried to kill herself multiple times, and Vincent never did. She was smart to marry up, and Vincent surely suffered without marriage, even if it had to be with a woman below his station. Vincent poured himself into one person, his brother, who also held the largest collection of his paintings, making it convenient for Jobanger to publish and promote them, whereas Frida's letters and paintings were more diffuse, and I have no idea with what difficulty or at what expense they may have been collected for publishing. It's been said that writing to other people leaves you with no record for yourself, and for that reason it's better to keep a journal. I guess that depends on your goal.